Imagine a carriage gliding through the mist toward Montgomery Hall, its wheels whispering of destiny. A duke, armored in duty. A bride, radiant in garnet silk. Nothing like the modest shadow he ordered. Under the gaze of a silent portrait and a house that worships restraint, sparks threaten to set propriety ablaze. A secret name waits behind sealed letters. A past refuses to stay buried. And between the thunder of reputation and the hush of longing stands a choice, honor or desire. Welcome to a Victorian romance, where every glance trembles with meaning. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from. And one question, what do you love most about period romances, the forbidden tension or the promise of redemption? Bath, England, the year of our Lord, 1854. The wind that curled along the hedgerows of Montgomery Hall was crisp with the fragrance of lavender and old stone, as if the house itself exhaled centuries of restraint and remembrance. The gravel path that led to the grand portico had been freshly swept. Each window pane gleamed like polished crystal, and the brass knocker upon the heavy oak door bore the crest of the Montgomery name, untarnished by time, untouched by sentiment. At precisely 3:30, the carriage arrived. It was not the modest coach the housekeeper, Mrs. Beadle, had expected. Instead, a lacquered black landau with gold-trimmed wheels came to a halt before the steps, drawn by 4 immaculate bays whose bridles shone like mirrors. A footman, liveried in deep burgundy, dismounted swiftly to open the door, and then the new Duchess descended. Lucinda Tremaine placed one gloved hand upon the edge of the door and stepped down without haste, her figure revealed in full for the first time. She wore a gown of garnet silk, so richly dyed it seemed to catch the last flickers of autumn sunlight like a flame held in fabric. The bodice clung perfectly to her slender waist, and the pagoda sleeves, edged in black chantilly lace, fluttered slightly as she adjusted the drape of her shawl. Upon her head rested a velvet bonnet, trimmed with silk roses the colour of dried wine, from beneath which curled tendrils of auburn hair peeked out like whispers of rebellion. She did not smile. She did not need to. Her hazel eyes, luminous and unreadable, scanned the towering facade of Montgomery Hall with the air of a woman who had walked into many rooms where she was not welcome and learned to survive each one. From the high windows, servants watched in silence. Inside, Lady Honoria Montgomery stood stiffly beside the drawing-room hearth, her black silk skirts unmoving, her cane held upright before her like a sceptre of disapproval. "She's too exotic," the dowager murmured, lips pinched. "This is Bath, not Vienna." From the vestibule, Mrs. Beadle approached, keys clinking faintly at her side. She curtsied. "Your Grace," she said, her voice steady. Lucinda nodded once. "Mrs. Beadle," she replied with perfect calm, her voice low and melodic, touched by something foreign. Continental, perhaps, but unmistakably ladylike. A pause. Then, with an elegant sweep of her gloved hand, Lucinda lifted the hem of her gown and ascended the steps, entering Montgomery Hall not as a bride trembling before her future, but as a duchess, assuming her place. She was 28. And she had come not to be tamed, but to endure. The house, though grand in structure, was silent as a mausoleum. The air carried the scent of beeswax and discipline. Heavy tapestries muffled the sound of her footsteps. The walls bore portraits of ancestors in powdered wigs and scarlet uniforms, solemn men, hollow-eyed women. None smiled. She was shown to her chamber, a suite on the east wing, reserved for the Duchess of Montgomery. The same rooms once occupied by the late wife. Lucinda noticed the faint dust upon the mantel, the untouched candlesticks, the air heavy with old perfume. She removed her gloves with care and stood before the tall mirror. The reflection met her gaze without flinching. Later that evening, dinner was served with precision. 3 courses, no conversation. The Duke sat at the opposite end of the long mahogany table. Alistair Montgomery was as still as the marble busts in the corridor, his black frock coat moulded to his tall frame, his posture unbending. His deep-set grey eyes studied the flame of the candelabra, not the woman before him. He did not ask about her journey, he did not compliment her appearance. Lucinda, unbothered, sipped her soup. Lady Honoria arrived late. Her cane tapped sharply with every step, as if marking time against the flow of grace. She greeted Lucinda with a glance and took her seat beside her son. Not once did she look her daughter-in-law in the eye. After the plates were cleared and the silence had been sufficiently maintained, Lucinda excused herself. The halls beyond the dining room were darker now, the sconces dimmed, the chill more noticeable. She did not retire to her chambers. Instead, she took a shawl and slipped through the servants' passage into the gardens, unseen by all but the moonlight. The roses had withered in the early frost, and the fountain in the centre basin had been drained. She walked with her head high, the gravel crunching beneath her steps, the weight of silence pressing against her thoughts. That was when she heard them. Voices, low and urgent, carried by the wind through an open window above. She paused in the shadows beneath the library terrace, her heart suddenly still. It was Alistair. "I did not marry for affection, Beadle, and I do not intend to feel it again. Not after what it cost me last time." The housekeeper's voice answered, hushed but maternal. "She is not the past, Your Grace. She is here now, and she has done nothing wrong. She is poised, perfectly poised. Too much so. I cannot tell where the mask ends." A pause. Then, "Duty is enough. It must be enough." Lucinda turned slowly, retreating from the window before the tears could rise. She would not cry, not here, not for a man who had already declared his affections forbidden ground. She had married a man who did not want to feel, but what he could not know was that she, too, had made her vows in silence. She had not come to beg for love. She had come to reclaim her dignity, and that would be enough, for now. The sun rose slowly over Montgomery Hall, gilding the frost-dusted gardens in shades of silver and bone. The windows of the east wing caught the light first, casting a glow upon the pale drapes of the Duchess's chambers. Lucinda Tremaine, now Lucinda Montgomery, stood before the tall mirror, brushing a final curl into place. Her gown was a soft dove grey, modest in cut but impeccable in detail. Silk-covered buttons, lace cuffs from Brussels, and a high neckline framed by a small cameo pinned at her throat. It was a gown meant not to dazzle, but to reassure. She knew the morning would demand precisely that. As she descended the grand staircase, her gloved hand trailing lightly along the polished banister, she heard no sounds of conversation. No clinking of porcelain, no footsteps from the servants. The hush of the house felt deliberate, like a breath being held too long. Breakfast was served in the smaller dining room, a chamber with tall windows facing the garden and pale wallpaper patterned with faded ivy. A fire smouldered in the hearth, casting warmth that did not reach the walls, but it was the portrait above the mantel that stole Lucinda's breath. There, in an ornate gold frame nearly as wide as the fireplace itself, hung the image of a young woman in ivory satin. Her face was delicate, almost translucent in its paleness, with soft golden hair coiled at her nape and pale blue eyes fixed forever on something beyond the canvas. She held a single lily in her hand. Her mouth was unsmiling, though not cold. It was the expression of a woman waiting for something she knew would never come. Lucinda stood for a moment too long. "She was 24 when it was painted," came a voice from behind. Lucinda turned. Alistair stood in the doorway, his dark coat perfectly buttoned, his silver pocket watch gleaming against his waistcoat. He did not offer a greeting. "She died shortly after," he added, his tone neither bitter nor warm, simply factual. Lucinda lowered her gaze. She was beautiful. "She was," he agreed, then moved past her to take his seat at the end of the table. The silence returned as the meal began. Toast, eggs, tea, each item placed before her with precision by a footman who refused to meet her eyes. Lucinda sipped her tea and felt the weight of the portrait pressing into the back of her skull, as though the young woman were still watching, even from the grave. After the dishes were cleared, Lady Honoria entered. Today she wore grey with black jet buttons, her mourning softened but not abandoned. Her cane clicked once against the floor, her expression unreadable. "Good morning, Your Grace." Lucinda offered with quiet grace. "Let us not pretend it is," Lady Honoria replied, sitting down as though the very air displeased her. "You are here. That is enough." Lucinda did not flinch. The morning passed in a series of obligations. A tour of the East Wing, polite inquiries from the staff, the recitation of the week's menu by Mrs. Beadle. By midday, Lucinda had memorized the location of every room except for one. A tall door at the end of the West Wing corridor, set apart from the others, framed in darker wood. It was locked. Later, while walking through the kitchens to observe preparations for the evening meal, Lucinda turned to Mrs. Beadle with calm curiosity. "There's a room near the West Terrace," she said. "It seems unused." The housekeeper paused in her task of folding a linen napkin. "The music room, Your Grace. It has not been opened in some time." Lucinda tilted her head. "Why?" Mrs. Beadle hesitated, then straightened her spine. "It belonged to the late Duchess. She played. His Grace has not wished it reopened since her passing." That evening Lucinda retired early, or so the household believed. Her gown changed for a simple house robe in cream. Her hair loosened from its pins, she slipped from her room and moved silently down the darkened halls. She carried a single candlestick. At the West Wing the corridor was colder, the windows uncurtained. The door stood at the far end, like a sealed memory. She tried the knob, locked as expected, but beside the door, tucked into a low drawer of the sideboard, she found a ring of brass keys. They were tarnished, unused. Her fingers trembled slightly as she tested each one, until the sixth gave a low, reluctant click. The door creaked open. The music room was blanketed in silence and dust. White sheets covered the furniture like mourning veils. The pianoforte stood in the center of the room, elegant and untouched. A single cracked window let in a line of moonlight that fell across the keys. Lucinda entered slowly, her slippers silent on the worn carpet. She set the candlestick down and pulled the sheet from the instrument with both hands, revealing polished mahogany dulled by time. She did not sit immediately. Her fingers hovered above the keys, then withdrew. She inhaled. And then, with the grace of someone who had not forgotten, only hidden, Lucinda sat and placed her hands upon the piano. She played a Viennese waltz, soft, wistful, barely above a whisper, a melody of drifting snow and candlelight, of longing without name. Her shoulders remained still, her face calm, but her eyes shimmered with an ache unspoken. The last note faded into silence. Only then did she feel it, that subtle shift in air, the presence behind her. She turned. Alistair stood in the doorway. His face was half in shadow, his eyes locked on her hands, unmoving. He had not knocked, he had not spoken, but he had come. For a moment, the silence between them was louder than music. Lucinda rose slowly. "Forgive me," she said. "I found the key." His voice, when it came, was barely above a murmur. "That piece. I have not heard it in years." "It was hers?" "No," he said after a pause. "It was mine." She looked at him then, not as a stranger nor as a wife, but as a woman seeing a man bruised by memories too deep to name. There was a sorrow in his expression that matched the final note she had played, and something else, something dangerous, longing. He stepped back without another word. Lucinda remained in the room long after he left. She touched the keys again, but did not play. Her fingers trembled, and she did not know why. The past hung thick in the air of Montgomery Hall, and now it had a melody. The sky above Bath was the colour of pearl that afternoon, soft and without promise of sun. A carriage bearing the crest of Montgomery Hall rolled down Milsom Street, its wheels humming against the cobbled stones as curious eyes turned toward its windows. Inside, Lucinda Montgomery sat composed, her posture elegant yet unyielding. She wore a gown of deep sapphire silk, the bodice trimmed in pale cream lace, and her gloves, imported from Paris, were of kid leather so fine they moved like skin. On her head sat a modest hat, pinned with a single plume, blue as a raven's wing. Nothing about her attire was garish, yet she radiated something that could not be sewn into fabric. Beside her sat Alistair, silent, distant, his eyes fixed upon nothing in particular. His presence was imposing, his suit impeccable, but his aura remained impenetrable. He had made no comment on her appearance before they departed the hall, nor had he offered his arm as she stepped into the carriage. And still, Lucinda sat tall, her chin slightly raised, not in defiance but in quiet resolve. She had learned long ago that the world did not soften for those who showed uncertainty. The assembly rooms loomed ahead like a temple to society's most sacred religion, appearance. Inside, the chandeliers blazed, their crystals catching every flicker of candlelight and casting it back in 1,000 fragments. The scent of polished wood mingled with lavender, and the subtle attention of ambition. Men and women of titles and fortunes circulated like dancers in a silent ballet, pausing only to assess, to whisper, to compare. When the Montgomerys entered, all turned. The Duke's return to society had been anticipated, but it was the Duchess who stole the breath from the room. Lucinda did not falter. She moved through the sea of nobility with serene precision, accepting each curtsy, meeting every gaze with one of her own. Her smile was slight, not coy, but measured, as if she understood too well the weight of eyes and the sharpness of whispered names. It did not take long for the murmurs to begin. "She walks like she was born on a stage. Did you hear she was raised abroad? Vienna, was it? I imagine she speaks French with an accent. She dresses like a painting. Too much elegance can be vulgar in a woman without lineage, but others spoke differently. What grace! The new Duchess is unlike any other. She reminds me of a marble statue, so still, yet alive. I heard she plays the piano like a dream." Lucinda smiled at none of them. She stood beside Alistair during the customary introductions. When Lord Melcombe, a long-time friend of the Montgomerys, offered a cordial nod, Alistair returned it with polite indifference. He did not introduce Lucinda nor take her hand. The gesture was not lost on the onlookers. At one point, as a string quartet began to play a gentle polonaise, Alistair excused himself to speak with a magistrate. Lucinda was left alone near a column, her gloved fingers clasped before her. A woman approached. Baroness Leland was of a certain age, her posture excellent and her tongue sharper than her ivory fan. Her gown, though finely made, lacked the subtle artistry of Lucinda's. Her eyes, however, gleamed with the cruel delight of a predator who had caught the scent of scandal. "Your Grace," she said, curtsying just enough to be proper. "Bath is so pleased to welcome you, though I dare say you bring a touch of foreign colour to our muted tones." Lucinda inclined her head. "I hope to be of service, Baroness. The city is beautiful." "Oh, indeed. It is also cautious. You understand? One hears so many stories when a lady arrives from abroad, especially without family. Without, shall we say, a conventional upbringing." Lucinda's smile held. "Stories are often more revealing of their tellers than their subjects." The Baroness blinked once, then leaned in slightly. "My dear, forgive me, but your elegance, it is so studied, so polished. One might believe it acquired on the stage, and you know how society regards actresses." The word dropped like poison into the wine. Lucinda's breath caught, not visibly, not audibly. But in the space behind her eyes, the words rippled like a crack in stained glass. Before she could reply, Alistair returned. His presence interrupted nothing. He offered the Baroness a nod, then turned to Lucinda. "I believe the carriage is ready," he said. "No warmth, no defence." The ride home was silent. The carriage lanterns flickered across Lucinda's face, casting her features in alternating gold and shadow. She did not look at her husband, nor did he offer her any explanation or comfort. The absence of words between them was louder than any exchange might have been. Back at Montgomery Hall, Lady Honoria was waiting in the drawing-room. She sat beside the fire, as still as a marble effigy, her hands folded in her lap. "Well," she said, as Lucinda entered, "you've made quite the impression." Lucinda removed her gloves slowly. "I'm told impressions matter here." "They do. And yours is complicated." Lucinda's gaze remained calm. "Because I speak French, or because I wear silk from Vienna?" "No, Honoria said, rising with the help of her cane, because you've given them cause to speak your name, and you are not yet strong enough to survive their judgments. I suggest you become invisible. It is safer. Lucinda turned toward the door. That has never been my strength. That night, alone in her chamber, she opened the drawer of her writing desk. From within it, she drew a letter, sealed in red wax, marked with a crest not English but Austrian. Her hand hesitated. The letter had arrived with her luggage. She had kept it hidden, unopened, unread, not because she feared its contents, but because it was the last tether to a life she had buried beneath layers of silk, courtesy, and silence. With deliberate care, she lit the fireplace. Then, lifting the letter in both hands, she held it above the flame. The wax melted first, then the paper caught with a sighing crackle. The scent of ink and parchment filled the air. She did not cry. She did not look away. But her hand trembled as the last corner blackened and disappeared into ash. Outside her window, the city of Bath slept beneath a veil of fog. Inside Montgomery Hall, the new Duchess stood alone, bathed in firelight, cloaked in memory, and watched always by the portrait of a woman who had died without ever being truly seen. Lucinda did not speak, but in the stillness of that hour, her silence was a vow. The storm came without warning. At first, it was only a murmur on the horizon, a low growl swallowed by the hush of late afternoon. But as twilight settled over Montgomery Hall, the skies darkened with brooding clouds, and the wind began to stir the hedges like a restless hand shaking the corners of the world. By the hour of supper, rain was pelting the tall windows with urgent fingers, and thunder rolled across the hills like distant drums of war. The evening meal had been hastily adjusted. The guests who had been invited from the neighbouring estate sent regrets. Their carriage turned back by the rising waters along the river path. Lady Honoria had retreated early to her chambers with a headache, real or convenient. Lucinda could not tell. What remained was a table set for two in the smaller dining room. White linens, crystal goblets, and the soft flicker of candlelight against the polished silver. Lucinda stood by the hearth, gazing into the fire as a servant poured wine into her glass. Her gown was a muted shade of violet, soft and sombre, with sheer sleeves that whispered as she moved. Her hair was pinned high but imperfectly, as if she had no patience that night for symmetry. She turned as Alistair entered, his black frock coat damp at the shoulders from crossing the courtyard. "Only the brave dine tonight," she said, her voice calm. "Or the unlucky," he replied, removing his gloves without humour. They took their seats across from one another, separated by silver platters and the unsaid. The storm growled again beyond the windows. For several minutes, the only sounds in the room were the occasional clink of utensils, the rustle of napkins, the muttering of wind beneath the eaves. Finally, Alistair set down his fork and regarded her with that impassive stare that concealed more than it revealed. "Why do you always look so composed?" he asked, not unkindly. Lucinda did not flinch. "Because I am not." He tilted his head, mildly intrigued. She continued, voice low, eyes fixed on her plate. "Composure is not absence of feeling, it's discipline, a habit I developed out of necessity." "In Vienna?" She met his gaze then, and in her eyes was the flash of something dangerous. Not anger, not fear. Something older, something forged in the quiet furnace of survival. "Yes," she said simply. The air between them shifted, subtly but distinctly. The storm outside intensified. A tree branch scratched against the pane like a warning. Alistair refilled his glass. "Society thinks you were on a stage. Were you listening?" she asked, arching a brow. He didn't answer. Lucinda folded her hands in her lap. "I suppose it would suit the narrative, wouldn't it? A mysterious woman from abroad, too polished, too poised. Naturally, she must have learned it in front of footlights. And did you?" She gave a soft, breathless laugh, not bitter, but dry like autumn leaves underfoot. "I learned it in drawing rooms with wolves in silk, in salons where men quoted poetry while calculating dowries. I learned it because to be silent was to disappear, and to speak clumsily was to be ridiculed, and I had no one to protect me." Alistair's fingers tightened around his glass. "Then why did you accept this marriage?" The answer hovered in the room for a heartbeat. Then two. "Because it offered me a roof," she said, "and because it was the only offer that did not require me to smile like a prize on display." Silence again, deeper this time. The candle nearest Alistair flickered once, then extinguished. The wind howled down the chimney throat, and shadows lunged across the walls like startled birds. He rose from his chair. Without a word, he crossed the room and lifted his coat from the rack. Returning to her, he held it out. "You're cold," he said. Lucinda hesitated. Then slowly, she extended her arms, allowing him to drape the coat around her shoulders. As he did, his hand brushed against the side of her neck. It was not a touch of seduction. It was accidental, or nearly so, but it lingered. The heat of his fingers against her skin ignited something beneath her ribs that no fire could explain. She looked up at him, breath caught between heartbeat and breath. He stepped back. Neither spoke again, as the rest of the meal passed in wordless contemplation. When it ended, Lucinda excused herself and made her way to the garden, drawn not by logic, but by the ache of being seen and still not understood. She walked without a bonnet, the rain now softened into a fine mist. The garden paths shimmered like wet silk, the stones slick beneath her slippers. The lanterns along the walkway had not been lit, but the storm's glow pulsed behind the clouds, illuminating the world in soft flashes. She paused by the rose arbor, its blooms long since withered. The air smelled of damp earth and unspoken things. Footsteps approached. Heavy, sure, not Alistair. "Evening, your grace," came the gravelly voice of Mr. Griffith. Lucinda turned. The head gardener stood beneath the arch of a bent tree, his cap soaked through, hands clasped behind his back. "You shouldn't be out in this, sir," she said. "I've weathered worse," he replied. Then, after a pause, he added, "I saw you at the assembly rooms. You held yourself like royalty." Lucinda tilted her head. "But I'm not. That's what makes it admirable." She offered a faint smile. "Is that what you came to tell me?" Mr. Griffith looked down at the path. "No, ma'am." The storm rumbled distantly. He lifted his gaze to hers. "Not all roots grow clean around here." Lucinda's breath caught. "I don't understand." "You will," he said, and turned to leave. "Just mind what you water." She watched him disappear into the shadows, her heart heavy with questions. Behind her, the hall loomed like a sleeping beast, majestic, silent, watching. She turned back toward the house, drawing Alistair's coat tighter around her shoulders. It still carried the faint scent of him, cedar, parchment, and something darker, something unknowable. As the rain thickened and the wind sang through the hedges, Lucinda stepped through the threshold once more. But the warmth of the house could not reach the place inside her that had begun to stir. A fire had been lit beneath the frost, and it would not easily go out. Morning at Montgomery Hall unfolded with the cold precision of a finely tuned instrument. The frost had crept silently across the window panes overnight, lace-like patterns etched by nature's invisible hand. Servants moved through the corridors in hushed tones, careful not to disturb the quiet tension that had settled over the house since the storm. The chimneys smoked dutifully, but the heat they offered seemed reluctant to reach the marrow of those who lived within. In the drawing-room, the fire had been lit early. Alistair Montgomery stood near the hearth, one hand braced against the mantel, the other holding an envelope the colour of old cream, the wax seal unbroken, until moments ago. The broken seal now lay on the floor, like the splintered crest of some fallen house. The letter had arrived with the morning post, delivered with the others, but unlike them, it bore no return address from England. The wax was stamped in crimson, marked by a symbol Alistair did not recognise, but the name on the envelope was unmistakable. Lady Lucinda von Schreiber. The handwriting was refined, continental, elegant. The script of someone familiar with the art of seduction in ink. Inside, the contents were brief. A private musicale will be held at Palais Brandenburg this December. The guests of Countess von Anhalt recall fondly the evenings when your voice last graced us. Should you be in Vienna once more, our stage, like our hearts, remains open. It was not the words that stung. It was what they suggested. He read it again, Then a third time, the firelight dancing across his expression, which grew colder by the moment. The woman upstairs, the one he had brought into his house, bore not only a past he did not know, but a name, a title, one he had not given her, von Schreiber. He folded the letter with deliberate care, as one might sheath a blade. By the time Lucinda entered the room, sunlight had broken through the frost and spilled across the carpet like pale gold. She wore a walking dress in soft brown wool, trimmed in velvet, and her hair was arranged in a braided coronet, elegant but without ostentation. She looked refreshed, unaware, luminous in her stillness. Alistair did not speak. He only held out the letter. Lucinda took it without suspicion, but when her eyes fell upon the name, the colour drained from her cheeks. Her fingers tightened on the paper. She did not read its contents. She didn't need to. "You opened my post," she said quietly. "I opened a lie," he replied. She looked up at him then, and in her eyes was no trace of shame, only weariness. "That name," he said, as though tasting something bitter. "Von Schreiber. Is it your true name, or another fiction to cloak some more convenient version of your past?" Lucinda walked to the window and stood there, one hand pressed to the glass. The frost was melting where her warmth met the cold. She did not turn to face him. "It was the name I used when I had no protection, when no one would claim me. You told me nothing of Vienna," he said. "Nothing of salons or musicales. And certainly not that you were known in a city where performers are praised, but rarely respected." Her back straightened. "You speak of respect as if it were freely given. I have only ever known it as something to be earned or stolen." He crossed the room with slow steps. "Were you an actress, Lucinda?" Her voice remained steady. "No." "Were you a singer?" "Yes." He paused. "Professionally?" A long silence passed. "At times," she said at last. The words landed like stone. "You deceived me." Lucinda turned to face him now. Her eyes burned, not with guilt but with the fire of 1,000 unspoken humiliations. "No," she said. "I survived you." Alistair's brow furrowed. "What does that mean?" She stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "After my father died, I had nothing, no dowry, no family, no name that mattered. I had only what Madame Cecilia offered, a place in her home, a voice I could use, and the understanding that appearances would always matter more than truth." "You were taken in by an opera singer," he said, as if reciting a verdict. "She was more noble than half the lords I met in those salons," Lucinda snapped. "She taught me to stand straight, to speak clearly, to enter a room without apologizing for the space I took. You should have told me. And would you have married me, Alistair?" she asked, her voice cutting but low. "If I had confessed that I once performed arias to keep warm in the winter, that I wore borrowed gowns and used false titles to avoid leering gazes and locked doors?" He did not answer. She stared at him for a long moment, then stepped back, her composure trembling at the edges. "You've mistaken your title for truth," she whispered, "and my survival for sin." Alistair's jaw clenched. "You were not the woman I thought you were." "No," she agreed. "I am far more." He looked away, unable or unwilling to meet the storm in her eyes. She turned toward the door. "Lucinda," he said suddenly, but without force. She paused, her hand on the frame. "Do you still wish to go back?" he asked. "To sing again?" She turned slightly, just enough to let the firelight catch the edge of her cheek. "No," she said, "but I wish you had asked me that before judging me." And then she was gone. Alistair remained in the drawing room, the letter still on the table, its seal broken like a covenant. The fire had burned low. Outside, the frost melted into rivulets that streaked the windows like tears the sky could not contain. Upstairs, Lucinda stood before her mirror, staring at the reflection of a woman she had spent years shaping. A woman of silence and restraint. A woman who had learned to wear grace like armor. But today, the armor had cracked. She opened the drawer of her dressing table and removed the only other letter she had saved from that chapter of her life. It bore no crest, no invitation, only a name, written in hurried ink. A name she had once loved, and a hand she had once held. She did not burn this one, not yet. Instead, she folded it once more, placed it beneath her undergarments, and closed the drawer. There would be no return to Vienna. But Vienna had returned to her, and it had laid bare a truth she had feared all along. She was not the one hiding. It was Alistair who could not bear to see. The days that followed the letter's revelation unfolded with the slow agony of a wound left unattended, deep, unseen, and steadily festering. Though the grand clock in the central hallway chimed with the same punctuality as always, the air within Montgomery Hall had altered. It was no longer simply cold. It was fractured. The drawing rooms, once filled with subdued civility, now hummed with quiet judgment. The servants walked as if on uneven stone, lowering their eyes when Lucinda passed, not out of deference, but out of discomfort. Or, worse, pity. It was Lady Honoria who struck first. She summoned Alistair to her chambers the morning after the letter had been discovered. Her maid, with anxious eyes and tightly folded hands, watched from the corner as he entered. The room smelled of rosewater and age, of things long preserved and resistant to decay. Honoria sat by the window, dressed in deep amethyst, her mourning jewels catching the light like shards of ice. "She must go," she said, before he had even spoken. Alistair stood rigidly across from her. "Mother, she lied. To you, to us, to the name." "She did not lie," he said. "She withheld." "Do not play with semantics," Honoria snapped. "She hid the truth, and now the city murmurs that a common singer wears the Montgomery tiara. Some say she was an actress, others say worse." Alistair's jaw clenched. "You believe that? I believe what they believe is enough. You know how quickly virtue can be buried by suggestion. She is not a fraud. No, she is worse. She is a woman who pretended not to be a fraud. And that is what people will remember." Alistair turned toward the window, where the garden, still damp from the last rain, lay grey and silent. He did not speak. Honoria's voice softened slightly, but not with kindness. "Annul the marriage before more damage is done. She has no family, no standing. It can be quiet, private." He did not reply. Only the ticking of the mantel clock filled the space between them. When he finally left the room, his hands were shaking. That same afternoon, the gossip bloomed like rot in the city. It floated through the tea parlours and laced itself into the fabrics of milliners' shops. The Duchess had been a performer in Vienna, they said. An actress, or worse, a courtesan under disguise. She used a foreign name, a stage name. Her grace was rehearsed, her elegance false, and the Duke, a man too blind, too broken, to see her for what she was. Inside the hall, the whispers reached the servants. Mrs. Beadle, with her ever-measured tone, put a stop to it where she could. In the linen room, in the kitchens, she defended Lucinda with the dignity due her station. But gossip, once spilled, has a way of seeping into the very mortar of walls. One evening, Lucinda overheard two maids whispering near the scullery. "She walks like she's still on stage," one said. "I'd wager she knows how to play more than just the piano." The other giggled, only to fall silent when Mrs. Beadle's shadow passed behind them. But worse than whispers was betrayal. A week later, Mr. Griffith discovered something unsettling. A letter, misaddressed, badly folded, had been dropped in the garden, half buried in wet leaves. The handwriting was familiar, too familiar. It belonged to Mabel, one of the younger maids. She had been writing to the Granvilles, a family whose eldest son had once pursued Alistair's hand for his sister, bitter rivals. And inside the letter, written in childish loops, were details of Lucinda's private life, her schedule, her solitary walks, even descriptions of her gowns. "She ain't just gossiping, sir," Mr. Griffith told Alistair in private. "She's feeding wolves." The girl was dismissed without ceremony. She left in tears, protesting her innocence, but the damage had been done. Lucinda said nothing. She simply grew quieter, colder, as if every brick of the house weighed upon her chest. When the invitation to the mayor's annual charity gala arrived, Lucinda hesitated. Her first instinct was to decline, to stay hidden within the hall's suffocating safety. But then she remembered who she had been before Bath, before England. Lucinda von Schreiber had learned to stand in rooms that wished she didn't exist. She would do so again. That evening she dressed in soft silver silk, with a modest neckline and sleeves trimmed in mother-of-pearl buttons. Her hair was swept up in a simple chignon, and around her neck she wore no jewels, only a narrow ribbon of velvet, the colour of mourning, tied like a promise just beneath her throat. Alistair said nothing when he saw her, only offered his arm. At the gala, the chandeliers blazed above an ocean of brocade and diamonds. The music played, laughter rose, and the walls echoed with the chatter of those pretending not to watch. Lucinda moved with practiced grace, but the air felt different. She felt it first when she approached the mayor's wife, a plump, powdered woman in purple lace. Lucinda curtsied. "Madam," the mayor's wife looked at her, slowly, pointedly, and stepped back, lifting her fan. "I believe we've not been properly introduced," she said with a smile as brittle as bone. Lucinda remained composed. "Indeed, I am Lucinda Montgomery." A pause. Then, delicately, "Oh, the Duchess." Of course. She did not extend her hand. The refusal struck harder than a slap. Lucinda straightened, her breath shallow. Around her, others pretended not to notice, but their silence betrayed them. She searched the room for Alistair. He stood across the ballroom, engaged in quiet conversation with two magistrates. He had seen everything, and he did nothing. That night back at Montgomery Hall, Lucinda removed her gloves with trembling fingers. She passed through the corridors like a ghost, her slippers silent on the rugs. The house was asleep, or pretending to be. She found herself at the music room. The key still sat in the drawer beside the door. She took it and entered. The pianoforte waited in the shadows. She lit no candle, only the moonlight guided her hands to the keys. She played Chopin, a nocturne, one of mourning and storm. Her fingers moved with exquisite precision, but her heart frayed with every note. It was not performance. It was confession. Tears fell, but not for Vienna, not for scandal. For the silence of a man who had once touched her neck as if she were porcelain, and then left her to shatter. In the corridor outside, Alistair stood still. He had followed the music. He did not enter, did not speak. He only stood, unseen, as her sobs mingled with the melody, and then quietly he wept, without knowing why, only that something was breaking, and it sounded like Chopin. The first light of morning stretched across the eastern sky like a slow sigh, barely piercing the heavy mist that clung to the gardens of Montgomery Hall. The earth, still damp from the night's frost, exhaled a faint perfume of moss and wilted roses. Their petals browned at the edges, bowed under the weight of autumn's final breath. A quiet stillness wrapped the grounds, interrupted only by the soft scraping of a trowel against soil and the whisper of fabric brushing against stone. Lucinda knelt by the rose bushes beneath the old arbour, her gloves soiled, her skirt damp at the hem. She had risen before the sun, restless, drawn not by duty nor decorum, but by something quieter and far more desperate, the need to feel something alive beneath her hands. The roses, once vibrant, now clung to brittle stems, their leaves curled inward as if in shame. She did not speak to them. She only worked. The shawl around her shoulders was loosely knotted, her hair unpinned beneath a bonnet that had seen better days. She had not dressed for display, but for truth. And in that hour, stripped of silk and candlelight, she looked younger and older, all at once. The wind stirred strands of hair across her cheek as she pressed her fingers into the earth and whispered to the roots as if they could hear her. Behind her, the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel. She did not turn. "You're up early," came his voice, low, rough with sleep or restraint. Lucinda looked over her shoulder. Alistair stood at the edge of the garden path, his coat unbuttoned, collar open, the wool of his trousers already stained from the walk. He looked like a man who had not slept, or perhaps had chosen not to. In his eyes, no trace of the title he wore, only a quiet disarray. A man without armor. "I couldn't sleep," she said. He nodded once, then stepped forward and without ceremony lowered himself beside her in the mud. She blinked, surprised, but said nothing as he removed his gloves and reached out to brush dead petals from a thorny stem. For a long moment, they worked in silence, two souls bent over something dying, trying to salvage what little life remained. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet it nearly vanished beneath the rustle of branches. "I never wanted to marry again." Lucinda paused, her hand still on the root of the bush. She did not look at him. "I know. I thought I could choose someone silent, elegant, uncomplicated." His breath caught. "You were none of those things." Now she turned, slowly, her eyes unreadable. Alistair stared down at his muddied hands. "My first wife. She never loved me. She loved a man without title, without expectations. But she married me because her family demanded it, because the match was prestigious, because it was what noble daughters are trained to do." Lucinda inhaled softly, her heart knocking against the cage of her ribs. "She became sick within a year," he continued. "Consumption. It took her slowly. She spent her final months in that room above the drawing room, beneath the portrait. She asked me once, just once, to let her go, to free her from her vow." He looked up then, his eyes shadowed but no longer cold. "I didn't. I held her to it. I told myself it was duty. But it was fear. I was terrified that if I let her go, I'd have to face the fact that I was never chosen, that no one had ever chosen me. Not truly." Lucinda said nothing. Her gloves were stained with soil, her breath shallow. The wind tugged at the edges of her shawl. "I married you expecting silence," he said, "but you filled this house with color, with breath, with defiance." He paused, eyes fixed on hers. "You walked in wearing garnet silk like it was armor, and I hated you for it." She swallowed, but her voice, when it came, did not tremble. "Why?" "Because you reminded me I was still alive." That was when she broke. Her hands, still buried in the soil, clenched around the roots of the rosebush. "I have done nothing but try to belong," she whispered. "Every room I've entered since childhood, I've had to prove I was worth the space I occupied. I've lied about my name, my past, my feelings, not to deceive, but to survive. And when I stopped pretending, I was punished for being real." Alistair leaned forward, his hand reaching for hers. She flinched, but only for a breath, and then allowed the contact. Their fingers entwined, stained with earth and something deeper. "I see you now," he said. "Too late, perhaps, but I see you." She closed her eyes, and then, hesitantly, painfully, she leaned forward, and their foreheads met. Their kiss was not perfect, not practiced. It did not come with orchestral swelling or grand declarations. It was trembling and real, born of silence and mud and loss. His hands cupped her face as if afraid she might vanish. Hers gripped his lapel like a woman drowning. And for one moment, one suspended, sacred moment, they were not titles, not wounds, not pride. They were only need, only warmth, only truth. "Alistair!" The voice struck like thunder. Lucinda tore herself from the kiss as Lady Honoria emerged from the path behind the hedgerow, her cane slamming into the stone with fury. Her eyes, once cool with disdain, now burned with rage. "What is this?" she hissed. "This spectacle? In the mud, no less, like common servants." Alistair stood. "Mother! Do not speak!" she snapped. I warned you what she would do, and now I find you grovelling in the garden, draped over a woman who has brought nothing but shame to this house." Lucinda rose slowly, her chin high despite the tears drying on her cheeks. "I will not permit this union to continue," Lady Honoria declared. "If you remain bound to her, Alistair, I will disown you. I will sever every tie to the family estates. I will cut your funds, your land, your title. What I gave, I can take away." Lucinda stepped forward, her voice quiet but steady. "Then do it." Both Montgomerys turned to her. "If what you gave was so easily taken," she said, her eyes glistening, "then it was never truly yours to give." Lady Honoria's breath caught, but Lucinda did not wait for more. She turned, walked past the frost-bitten roses, past the man who had finally spoken the truth, past the woman who never would, and disappeared into the mist of morning. Alistair remained in the garden, alone with the soil and the silence. But something in him had broken open. and he could not go back. The storm arrived with no warning. Rain fell in sheets against the windows of Montgomery Hall, tracing slow, mournful lines across the glass, as if the sky itself had taken to weeping. The wind howled through the chimneys and rattled the shutters like the restless breath of a house caught between decisions. In the Duchess's chamber, Lucinda stood before an open trunk, her hands carefully folding the last of her gowns. She moved in silence, her expression unreadable, her shoulders drawn, as if bracing for the weight of something far heavier than her belongings. The wardrobe hung open behind her. The scent of lavender sachets and old rosewood lingered in the air. Her gloves were neatly stacked, her slippers wrapped in linen. A single ribbon, midnight blue and frayed at the edges, remained in her palm for a moment longer than necessary before she placed it gently atop her silk shawl. The room had never truly belonged to her, and yet every corner now echoed with her absence before she had even stepped away. At her writing desk, a single letter lay sealed in cream paper, addressed in her hand. No flourish, no embellishment, just a name. Alistair. She stared at it for a long while, her fingers hovering above the parchment, as if her heart had been pressed into every word. Then she turned away. Downstairs, the servants moved with careful discretion, though whispers clung to the hallways like dust to velvet. Mrs. Beadle stood near the foyer, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed from a storm of her own. "Have the footman seen to her trunk?" Lady Honoria asked, stepping down the staircase with deliberate poise. "Yes, Your Grace," Mrs. Beadle replied, voice clipped. Honoria gave a curt nod. "Then let her go. The family will recover." But as Lucinda passed them, wrapped in a grey travelling cloak, her bonnet tied firmly beneath her chin, Mrs. Beadle could not meet her gaze, and Lady Honoria, despite her icy triumph, looked away first. Outside, the carriage waited, steaming in the rain. Lucinda stepped into it without hesitation. She had made peace with the choice. Inside the library, Alistair found the letter just after midday. The fire had burned low, forgotten. The scent of damp parchment mingled with the faint trace of her perfume, bergamot and something softer he had never been able to name. His fingers trembled slightly as he broke the seal. "You never promised me love," the letter began, "but I gave you all I had. I came here to belong, not to conquer. I asked for nothing but space to breathe and kindness enough to survive. What I received was silence, and from that silence I built a life. Not the one I dreamed of, but the one I was given. I leave not because I am ashamed, but because I am proud. Proud enough to know that love cannot be begged for, proud enough to refuse to stand between a man and his mother, proud enough to go without being chased. If ever you look back, I hope you will remember me, not as the woman they whispered about, but as the woman who waited to be seen. Lucinda." The letter fell from his hand, and Alistair moved. Within minutes he was on horseback, the rain slicing against his skin as he rode down the hill and into the narrow roads leading toward the Bath station. Mud splashed up the legs of his riding boots, and the hooves of his mount thundered through the rising storm. Carriages passed him on the opposite road, none bearing her. The station was nearly empty. The last stagecoach to London had left 15 minutes prior. He stood beneath the overhang, chest heaving, soaked to the bone, eyes scanning the platform as if she might appear from the shadows and say it had all been a test. But she did not. Rain poured from the brim of his hat, and still he did not move. Not until he remembered, not until the memory of her, seated among the Roman colonnades, her voice calm, her gaze steady as she stood beside him in a city of strangers, returned with the force of lightning behind his ribs. He turned his horse. The Roman baths had always been a place of ghosts, of echoes, of history carved in stone. And there she was. Lucinda sat alone beneath the shelter of the ancient colonnade, her cloak wrapped tightly around her, her bonnet discarded beside her. Her face was turned toward the steam rising from the waters, and in the haze of the rain and mist, she looked like something half-remembered from a dream, unreal and yet more vivid than ever before. She heard the hooves first, and then the breath of the horse as Alistair dismounted. She did not stand, she did not look up. He crossed the slippery stone carefully, each step deliberate, each breath held as though he feared the weight of his own voice might shatter the spell between them. "I went to the station," he said at last. "I didn't take the coach," she replied softly. "Why?" She turned her face toward him. Raindrops clung to her lashes like crystal beads, and her cheeks were flushed not with cold, but with restraint. "Because I didn't want to be chased," she said. "I wanted to be chosen." Alistair stepped closer. "I was late, but I see you now." Her chin quivered. "Do you?" "I see the woman who survived what others would have surrendered to. The woman who walked into my house like a storm dressed in silk. The woman who challenged me, defied me, and gave me back the breath I didn't know I'd been holding for years." Lucinda's lips parted, but no words came. "I don't fear your past," he whispered. "I fear losing your future." She stared at him, her eyes wide, raw, as if the very air between them had been cut open. "I don't fear shame anymore," she said. "I've lived with it too long. What I fear is loving a man who won't fight for me, who won't lift his voice when I'm dragged through the mud, who'll watch me burn and call it duty." Alistair reached for her hands, soaked and trembling. He held them gently, but with resolve. "I didn't know how," he said. "Until now." Rain poured around them, pounding against the stone, but they stood as if untouched by the storm. "I will fight for you, Lucinda. I will choose you. In every room, in every battle, I will not be silent again." And then he kissed her. In the rain, in the mist, beneath the ghosts of ancient walls, he kissed her, not with ceremony or control, but with the weight of every word he had never said. Her hands clutched the fabric of his coat, and in that kiss, the storm began to still. They had not found peace, but they had found each other, and for Lucinda Montgomery that was a beginning worth everything. The morning sun did little to warm the stone facade of St. Edmund's Cathedral, where icicles clung like fragile daggers to its arches. Inside, the winter service had ended, but murmurs lingered among the congregants, their voices laced with judgment, pity, and speculation. Bath had always been a city of whispers, and now the whispers carried the name Montgomery like frost on glass, thin, brittle, and ready to shatter. Lady Honoria Montgomery stood beneath the vaulted ceiling, facing the bishop with a spine rigid as carved marble. The air between them was cold, though not from the season. The bishop, a man of strict conviction, had not smiled once since his arrival. "Your son's indiscretions have brought shame upon a lineage once revered," he said, voice echoing against the choir loft. "To accept a woman of uncertain past as duchess, an actress no less, what example does that set for our flock?" Honoria, ever the sentinel of propriety, drew herself taller, but her colour waned. "It was not my doing," she replied, though her tone cracked faintly at the edges. "I advised against it." The bishop's silence was heavier than his words. Moments later, as she turned to leave, her steps faltered. A sudden pallor drained her face, and her gloved hand clutched at the edge of a pew. Then, without ceremony, Lady Honoria Montgomery collapsed in the centre aisle of the cathedral, her hat falling askew, a gasp rippling through the congregation like wind through reeds. By midday, the dowager was back at Montgomery Hall, confined to her bed beneath an embroidered canopy of ivory silk. The household stood on edge. The doctor, summoned at once, murmured terms like nervous exhaustion and strain upon the heart. Lucinda stood at the threshold of the dowager's chambers, hesitant, one gloved hand resting on the doorframe. It had been hours since the fall, and the halls outside the room were unnaturally silent. She expected to be turned away. Instead, Mrs. Beadle opened the door wider and gave a small, urging nod. Within the room, heavy drapes softened the winter light. A single fire cracked in the hearth, its glow touching the carved posts of the canopy bed, where Lady Honoria lay propped by pillows. Her silver hair, once so carefully arranged, now hung in loose wisps against her temples. "Come in," the dowager said, her voice gravel-soft, stripped of its usual steel. Lucinda stepped closer, the hem of her day-gown whispering across the Aubusson rug. She did not bow, nor speak, but her eyes met Honoria's with a quiet fortitude. "I've wronged you," the older woman said, surprising them both. "Not just you, him." Most of all, Lucinda remained silent, letting the words find their way through the frailty. Alistair's first wife, Honoria continued, was never what society needed her to be. She had a warmth I feared would embarrass the name. When she begged to leave him, I refused her. I made her stay. I told her a Montgomery woman does not walk away. Her fingers clutched at the embroidered bedspread. She died in this house, she whispered, but I killed her spirit long before that. I thought I was protecting him. Lucinda stepped to the side of the bed, her hands folded over her skirts. I see now, Honoria continued, blinking against the pressure behind her eyes, that I was preserving stone while the heart withered. Lucinda's voice, when it came, was soft and unflinching. You feared the world's judgment more than your own son's happiness. Yes, Honoria nodded once, tremulously. And yet you who have given him a reason to feel again, I have treated you with disdain. A silence bloomed between them, delicate as snow. I do not ask for your forgiveness, Honoria said. I've not earned it. Lucinda sat at the edge of the bed, her hand resting lightly atop the dowager's. Forgiveness is not earned. It is given when there is nothing left to fight for but peace. Lady Honoria's fingers curled around hers. Her next words trembled from the depth of her throat. Look after him. He's more fragile than he pretends, and you, my daughter, are stronger than I ever knew. Lucinda's lips parted in disbelief, but Honoria's hand tightened as if to anchor the truth of the moment. From the corridor, Alistair watched in stillness, unseen, a shadow across the threshold, a son who had long mourned a mother who never mourned with him. Now, he turned away, not out of indifference, but to carry out the final task that would free them both. Later that afternoon, under grey skies and the scent of impending snow, Alistair strode into the Bath City Council chambers. He wore a charcoal frock coat and carried no emblem of nobility save the resolve in his eyes. The councilmen, landed gentry, clerks, merchants and magistrates, turned at his entrance. Some looked surprised, others whispered behind gloved hands. At the head of the table, the town magistrate, Lord Hewitt, adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat. To what do we owe the honour, Your Grace? He asked. Alistair took the floor with the calm of a man who had come not to beg, but to pronounce. You speak of honour, he began. Then allow me to speak plainly. The murmurs ceased. There have been rumours, he continued. Whispers that my wife, the Duchess of Montgomery, is unfit, that she comes from questionable beginnings, that her refinement is a masquerade. He paused. I will not dignify gossip, but I will offer the truth. He looked at each man, steady and unwavering. My wife is a woman of resilience, grace, and conviction. Her name before marriage is irrelevant, because the name she bears now she honours with every breath. She has brought dignity to my household, not disgrace. Where I once let duty silence my soul, she brought music. Where society offered cruelty, she offered mercy. And where fear once governed this family, she now brings courage. Silence held. I ask no one to forget their standards, he said, only to apply them to themselves before casting stones. He inclined his head once. That is all. As he turned to leave, something shifted in the room. Not noise, not applause, but something deeper. A soft recalibration of judgment. The magistrate rose to his feet. Others followed one by one, in an unspoken gesture not of submission, but of respect. By evening, the first notes of this declaration echoed beyond the walls. The tide had begun to turn. At Montgomery Hall, the news arrived before Alistair did. Mrs. Beadle brought the word to Lucinda, who stood on the balcony above the courtyard, arms wrapped in a wool shawl, the frost kissing her cheeks. He spoke of you as a man in love, the housekeeper whispered. Lucinda turned toward the wind, eyes shining with something too complex for a single name. And in the warmth of the dowager's chambers, where winter light touched silver hair and softened wrinkles long defined by pride, Lady Honoria Montgomery smiled faintly in her sleep, finally at peace. Winter had descended upon Bath with regal stillness. Snow fell in soft drifts, settling atop iron gates and garden statuary like lace laid gently by a careful hand. The trees of Montgomery Hall stood cloaked in white, their bare limbs silhouetted against the grey sky. Icicles glistened along the eaves, and the long drive leading to the great house was hushed, the crunch of hooves and carriage wheels absorbed by the snow's thick embrace. Inside the manor, however, there was a quiet hum of life, subdued yet purposeful. The household moved with unusual grace. Footmen carried polished trays up the stairwells. Maids bustled through corridors bearing armfuls of linens and evergreen garlands. Candles were trimmed. Silver was buffed to mirror finish. The grand chandelier in the central hall had been lowered for cleaning, and now sparkled like captured starlight. A musicale was to be held, Montgomery Hall's first in nearly a decade. But more than a soirée, it was a resurrection, a reclamation. An unveiling of truth, not in words, but in harmony. Lucinda stood before the arched windows of her bedchamber, her hands clasped before her waist. The pale morning light haloed her silhouette, casting her reflection against the frosted glass. Her gown, tailored in Paris and sent in secret weeks prior, hung waiting behind her, a whisper of elegance in pearl-grey silk, the colour of fog kissed by moonlight. Its sleeves were long, trimmed with lace from Calais. The bodice hugged her form with quiet sophistication. It was a dress neither ostentatious nor demure, only utterly hers. She turned from the window as the door opened behind her. Mrs. Beadle entered with reverence, carrying a velvet case. Inside lay the diamond and pearl necklace that had belonged to Alistair's grandmother, untouched for years. "The Duke asked that you wear it," she said, her voice hushed. "He said it is yours now." Lucinda's breath caught, not for the value of the gift, but for its meaning. She reached for the necklace slowly, the coolness of the gems tingling against her fingertips. As Mrs. Beadle fastened the clasp at her nape, Lucinda looked once more at her reflection, not to inspect her appearance, but to steady herself. In the hours before dusk, the carriages arrived. Sleighs with crested panels, broughams and barouches pulled into the courtyard, their lanterns aglow, their occupants cloaked in furs and silks. Guests of prominence and pedigree stepped down onto the salted stones, greeted by footmen in livery and the soft strains of a chamber trio echoing from within. The grand entrance had been transformed. Garlands of holly and ivy crowned the archways. Candles floated in crystal holders, suspended from the ceiling like stars. The scent of mulled wine mingled with pine, cinnamon, and old wood, polished to perfection. But it was the music room that drew the greatest attention. For nearly 10 years, the room had remained locked, sealed by silence and shadow. It had once been the private domain of the late Duchess. Few had entered since her passing. Many believed it would remain forever shut, a shrine to grief, a tomb to sound. Now, as the doors opened to reveal its rebirth, the guests gasped in collective awe. The room glowed. Amber light radiated from chandeliers and sconces newly restored. The walnut floors gleamed. The long-forgotten pianoforte stood unveiled at the centre, freshly tuned, its curves polished to reflect every flame. The scent of beeswax and pine mingled with fresh air from windows cracked open just enough to invite the cold. Lucinda waited at the edge of the threshold, her gloved hands trembling around the folded sheet of parchment, her original composition. She had not titled it. There were no words sufficient to describe what it was. It was not an ode to grief or defiance. It was not an elegy to survival. It was simply hers. Alistair approached quietly, as he always did when his emotions were most visible. He wore black with a white cravat, the only embellishment a pocket square of garnet silk, echoing the dress she had worn on her first day at Montgomery Hall. He did not speak at once, only offered his arm. She accepted. Together, they crossed the room. The crowd parted respectfully. Some guests curtsied. Others watched in silence, as if afraid a sound might shatter the fragility of the moment. Lucinda sat before the pianoforte. Alistair stood behind her, one hand resting at the small of her back, not possessive but grounding, reassuring. She exhaled and played. The first note rang clear, soft as candlelight. Then came another and another. The melody unfolded like breath after long drowning, tentative, rising, defiant, tender. Her fingers moved not with flourish, but with devotion, as though every measure was a memory redeemed, every phrase a fragment of a self once hidden. The room faded. Only the music remained. When the final chord settled into the hush, no applause followed, not at first. The silence was reverent, a moment suspended in stillness. Then came a solitary clap from the magistrate, then another, and another, until the entire room stood in ovation, not only for her skill, but for the truth she had told through melody. Alistair stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice firm but gentle, "when I married, I expected silence. I sought a life of duty, order, and self-restraint. I did not ask for joy. I did not anticipate light." He looked down at Lucinda, who stood beside him now, breath still catching. "She gave me music." A soft murmur swept through the room, tears, nods, smiles breaking open like buds in spring. The orchestra struck a waltz. Alistair extended his hand. Lucinda placed hers in it, and they danced, not as symbols of title, not as pawns of society, but as two people who had endured, bled, and chosen to love anyway. Their steps were slow at first, measured, then freer. His hand guided her waist with reverence, her fingers laced with his at her shoulder. They moved in harmony, not to impress, but to feel, not to perform, but to belong. Around them others joined. The ballroom came alive with movement, laughter, and renewed belief. Outside, snow began to fall again, thick, soft, endless, covering the earth in white as if to say, "Begin again." From the balcony above, Mrs. Beadle watched with quiet pride. Behind her, Mr. Griffith stood with arms folded, nodding once. Even Lady Honoria, wrapped in a shawl in her chamber, listened to the distant strains of music and smiled without bitterness. In that moment, Montgomery Hall was no longer a house of ghosts. It was a home. And in the warmth of the ballroom, beneath the golden light and the promise of winter's hush, Lucinda and Alistair found what they never dared to believe they could deserve. Not just love, but peace, and each other, forever. Bath, England spring of 1860. The wisteria had returned to the southern wall of Montgomery Hall, blooming with the fervour of a long-awaited embrace. Their lavender tendrils spilled down the stone like lace from a bridal veil, perfuming the air with a fragrance that made one pause, if only to remember. It was the 5th spring since the snow-covered night that had opened the music room's doors again. 5 years since love, long resisted, had finally been named aloud and met without fear. Lucinda sat beneath the pergola in the west garden, a light shawl draped across her shoulders. The years had only refined her beauty. Her eyes, once guarded, now carried the softness of a woman who had built a life on her own terms, and had been loved for it. A sketchbook rested on her lap, filled with music not yet played, and memories not yet named. At her feet, her daughter gathered violets with solemn purpose. Rosalind was 4, half mischief, half melody. With her father's brow and her mother's hands, she hummed to herself in uncertain tunes, plucking each flower as if choosing from the stars. "Not too many, Rosie," Lucinda said gently. "The bees will protest." The little girl giggled and twirled. Behind them, the conservatory doors opened, and Alistair emerged, greyer at the temples, but more at ease than he had ever been. He no longer walked as a man guarding his heart, but as one who had laid it at another's feet and found it returned, unbroken. His cravat was loose, his sleeves rolled. In one hand he carried a book of essays, in the other, a rose. "For my Duchess," he said as he approached, offering the bloom. Lucinda accepted it with a smile that still made his breath catch. "How long do you suppose we'll keep pretending I am still the dazzling young woman who arrived in garnet silk?" she teased. "As long as I draw breath," he said simply. They sat side by side on the bench, Rosalind soon curling up between them with her wildflowers and mud-streaked boots. Alistair leaned down to kiss his daughter's hair, then rested his hand atop Lucinda's, their fingers intertwining in silent communion. The estate had changed, as had they. Mrs. Beadle now reigned as housekeeper emeritus, rarely seen without a knitting basket and a brandy for medicinal purposes. Mr. Griffith's roses had won second prize in the regional fair last summer, a result he declared a travesty and an insult to honest soil. Lady Honoria had passed 3 winters prior, her final days quieter than anyone had dared hope. In the end, it was Lucinda who had sat with her, reading psalms and placing snowdrops by her window. The dowager had gone into the next world, having reconciled with the one she'd tried to control. Her will left a modest trust for Rosalind's future and a music scholarship in Lucinda's name at the local conservatory. As for society, the gossips had moved on. A new scandal always replaced the old. But some hearts had not forgotten. The mayor's wife, whose rebuke had once humiliated Lucinda at the charity gala, now sent yearly invitations to host musicales together. Lucinda never accepted, but she always sent a thank-you note, written with grace sharpened by memory. In town, they called her the Duchess who played Chopin barefoot once, though none could confirm the tale. She was both myth and woman, wife and mother, artist and survivor. And Alistair, he had stepped down from several public duties, choosing instead to fund arts programs for orphaned children and scholarships for young musicians. All because, he once said in a public address, I married a woman whose voice was louder than my silence. That afternoon, as golden light filtered through the trees and Rosalind dozed with her head on Lucinda's lap, Alistair turned to his wife with a quiet reverence. I used to believe love was a fire that burned everything down, he murmured. Lucinda traced his hand with her fingertips. And now I know it's what rebuilds what we thought we'd lost forever. From inside the house, faint music floated out. The piano in the music room being played by a young pupil Lucinda had begun mentoring. It was not perfect. The notes stumbled, but it was honest and alive. Lucinda closed her eyes and leaned her head against Alistair's shoulder. The garden bloomed around them. The past no longer haunted, the future no longer frightened, and the present was enough, more than enough. The Duke and the woman he had never expected had not merely endured, they had prevailed. Together, always. If you've made it to this point in the story, you've witnessed something rare. Not just a love story, but a journey of healing, of rediscovery, of what it means to choose love, not once, but every single day. Lucinda and Alistair taught us that love doesn't always arrive the way we expect. Sometimes it walks through the door wearing garnet silk, holding pain behind a poised smile. Sometimes it's buried beneath pride, silence, and fear. And yet, when nurtured with truth, forgiveness, and courage, love grows into something unshakable, something worth fighting for. This was never just about a duchess or a duke. It was about second chances, about daring to be seen, about learning that your past does not define your worth, and that the most beautiful music often comes after the silence. We would love to hear what you felt as you followed their story. Tell us in the comments, what moment moved you most? And if you read this far, write the word music below so we know you were with us until the very last note. If this story touched you and you'd like to help us continue bringing these deeply emotional period romances to life, consider sending a super thanks in any amount that feels right for you. Your support helps our small team of writers, editors, and voice artists keep telling the kinds of stories that stay with you long after the screen fades to black. And if supporting financially isn't possible right now, please know this: sharing this story with your friends, family, or on social media makes a tremendous difference. Your voice helps us reach more hearts and keeps these stories alive. Before you go, be sure to check the video cards or the description below for more unforgettable tales of love, loss, redemption, and triumph. There's a whole world of historical romance waiting for you. Thank you for being part of our story. And remember, sometimes the greatest love is the one we never saw coming.